Kia ora, my name is Vixen Temple. I'm a takatapui witch, writer, and performance artist determined to burn the patriarchy. I am also a self-proclaimed goth. I'm a lover of all things macabre, all things the occult, and finally, I have a Bachelor of Arts in Film, Media, and Theatre Studies, so I have written many an essay on the original Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror. So like any gothic film nerd, I was extremely excited to see Robert Eggers' adaptation of Nosferatu, as well as being very curious about what themes and motifs he would explore in his adaptation. In this essay, I want to talk about a concept that was ever present throughout the film, and that is death and the Maiden. Death and the Maiden is a common motif used in art and literature, especially during the Renaissance era. The imagery portrays a young woman being seized by a personification of death, often portrayed as a skeletal figure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the story of Persephone and Hades, where the maiden goddess Persephone, known at this point of the story as Kore, is dancing amongst a field of flowers when she is suddenly abducted by her uncle, Hades, god of the underworld. Hades declares that he has chosen Kore to be his bride, and by the end of the story, she becomes Persephone, queen of the underworld. Another example of the association between maidenhood and death comes from my own Māori lineage through the story of Hine Nui Te Po. The daughter of the god of forests, Tāne Mahuta, and the first woman, Hine Huone, Hine Nui Te Po was given the name Hine Te Tama, the Dawn Maiden. Tāne weds his daughter, and together they bear many children. All the while, Hine Te Tama is unaware that her husband is also her father. When she does eventually discover the truth, she is consumed by shame. She descends into the darkness, the underworld, where the light cannot illuminate her humiliation. There she transforms herself into Hine Nui Te Po, great woman of the night, where she awaits to be reunited with her children upon their death. As we can see, there are many cultures throughout the world that speak to the motif of death and the maiden. These two seemingly polarizing notions, a young maiden at the prime of her youth and a much older skeletal figure, do in fact have a lot more in common than their visual motifs portray. So why is womanhood so strongly associated with death? And what does all of this have to do with Nosferatu? Sit, drink, and let us talk about woman, death, and the erotic. Women have historically been linked with death because without life, there is no death, and women, or those of us with wombs, are the creators of life. Now, before we carry on, I do just want to note that not all people who possess wombs identify as women, nor do they want to be mothers. But when looking at it through the patriarchal lens of a two-gender heteronormative binary, the idea of womb envy has been ever present throughout the history of patriarchal societies. Womb envy refers to the notion of cis men being both jealous and insecure of the fact that the survival of our species rests upon women, or those of us with wombs. You see, contrary to popular belief, patriarchy is not the natural order of things. There was a time when humanity lived as a matriarchy, during which those with wombs were understood to be the creators of life and thus guaranteed the survival of our species. The ability to give birth was seen as a sacred act in matriarchal societies, and as a result, goddess culture was heavily worshipped. According to Nickie in her book, Whores in History, Prostitution in Western Society, quote, "Perhaps most miraculous of all, women were capable of producing children from their own bodies, an act of pure creative magic in the eyes of men, ignorant of their own part in reproduction. Women were naturally enough seen as the living embodiment of a universal generative force, which Stone Age humans conceptualized in the form of a goddess." End quote. When men did, however, become aware of their role in the reproductive process, this revelation is believed to be what triggered the violent shift from a matriarchy to a patriarchy. In her 1986 essay, The Creation of Patriarchy, Gerda Lerner refers to Elizabeth Fisher's theory that men discovered their importance in reproduction through the domestication and breeding of animals. And as a result, tribes of male-dominated nomads began to invade matriarchal societies around 3000 BC. As male power began to assert its dominance over matriarchal societies, it brought with it the shift away from goddess worship, in which women were understood to be the creators of life, and instead stories of a male god and immaculate conception rose in prominence. And with this came the rise in misogyny and the fear of witches. According to Marion Woodman and Eleanor Dixon in their book Dancing in the Flames, The Dark Goddess and the Transformation of Consciousness, quote, "It can hardly be a coincidence that the same period that saw Mariology, the study of Mary, reach the greatest heights of theological definition and refinement with the triumph of the doctrinate of the Immaculate Conception, also saw the outbreak of witch hunts that took the lives of upwards of 1 million women between the 14th and 17th century." End quote. Did you have a morbid fascination with the Black Plague growing up, or are you neurotypical? I remember learning about the Black Plague when I was 11, and it still to this day remains a special interest of mine. What can I say? I'm a woman, and I'm obsessed with death. The Black Plague, or the Black Death, devastated Europe for almost a decade during the 14th century and vastly contributed to the association of woman and death. By 1349, the plague had killed at least a third of the population of England. Marion Woodman and Eleanor Dixon note in Dancing in the Flames that the Black Plague had an enormous effect on the psyche of the Western world. Woodman and Dixon state, quote, "The plague was a catalyst for a major shift in human perception in many areas in cosmology, in science and medicine, in attitudes towards women, and in philosophy and religion itself. Unexplained and irrational, death was an insult, an aberration thrown in the face of man's newly acquired image as the controller. Man turned increasingly to his own rational power and began to look upon death, nature, woman, his own body, and sexuality as being irrational, and therefore as something to be subdued and brought under more rigorous control." End quote. So instead of celebrating the cyclical nature of life, as was typical in matriarchal societies, patriarchy sees feminine sexuality as immoral, corrupt, and even monstrous. In a 1486 report by Dominican inquisitors Henrik Kramer and James Sprenger, they state, quote, "But the natural reason is that she, woman, is more carnal than a man, as is clear from her many carnal abominations. And it should be noted that there was a defect in the formation of the first woman, since she was formed from a bent rib, that is, a rib of the breast, which is bent as it were in a contrary direction to a man. And since through this defect she is an imperfect animal, she always deceives." End quote. Sounds like an incel to me. During this time, men despised themselves for their sexual attraction towards women, as well as their dependence on the feminine reproductive system. Not much has really changed. Because no matter how much men tried to rewrite history, they could not deny nor change the fact that those of us with wombs, in their eyes women, are essential and necessary to the survival of our species. By the time it was over, it is estimated that 75 million people had succumbed to the Black Plague. And with this came the desire to control disease, leading to the increase of the study of anatomy. And with this, we saw a massive cultural shift away from the church towards science. You see, this plague was so disastrous, so devastatingly gruesome, that survivors of the plague struggled to find a higher meaning to it. Prior to the plague, Western societies placed their faith upon God's will. They believed in a fixed order. But survivors of the Black Plague were forced to question this mentality. The association of woman with death, combined with man's fear of his own sexual impulses towards women, led to the link between woman, death, and the erotic. In his book, Western Attitudes Towards Sex, Philip P. Aries notes that by the end of the 15th century, we saw themes of death take on a more erotic meaning. He states, quote, "Like the sexual act, death was henceforth increasingly thought of as a transgression which tears man from his daily life, from rational society, from his monotonous work, in order to make him undergo a paroxysm, plunging him into an irrational, violent, and beautiful world." End quote. Aries provides examples of erotic death motifs in art, including the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa and Blessed Ludovica Albertoni by Gian Lorenzo Bermani, two marble statues created in the 16th century in which Burmani juxtaposed the death agony with an orgasmic trance. I sincerely apologize if I butchered that pronunciation. Despite being vastly different experiences, orgasm and death do share similarities, including a loss of control, intense sensation, transcendence, a surrender to one's body. Both the act of an orgasm and death are taboo topics in Western societies, two things that have historically been feared but are, at the end of the day, very natural human experiences. Despite this taboo, and you'll very rarely hear me say this, not all men view death as something to be subdued and brought under more rigorous control. During the Age of Enlightenment that took place in the 17th and 18th century Europe, we saw a continuation of the rise of individualism that the trauma of the Black Plague had brought about. This contributed to the Romantic era, an artistic and intellectual movement that was both a continuation and a rejection of the Enlightenment era. Romantic poets explored themes of love, nature, human emotion, and, you guessed it, death. Romanticism did not see death as something to be feared, but instead viewed death as ecstasy, as catharsis, as something reassuring and beautiful. The one guarantee in life is that we will eventually die, and artists and poets of the Romantic era viewed this through a romanticized lens. In his 1801 work, Sappho at Leucate, Antoine Jean Gros shows the tragic heroine and poet Sappho liberating herself from the rejection of her lover by throwing herself from a cliff. The illumination of the moon through the dark and ominous clouds signals a sign of hope. A subtle smirk sits upon her face, hinting at a sense of liberation through death. Okay, so we've now seen examples of the fear of sex and death as well as the romanticization of sex and death. But what does all of this have to do with Nosferatu, you may be asking? Well, did you see the film? Just kidding. Everyone interprets art differently, and since this is my video essay and my interpretation of the film, allow me to elaborate. I think that Eggers' Nosferatu is a film that touches on both the fear of death and women's sexuality, as well as the romanticization and eroticism associated with death. You see, throughout the film, Count Orlok is time and time again referred to as death, or the plague. So if Orlok is death, then Ellen is our maiden. Let's talk about Ellen, because oh my gosh, I am obsessed with her. Now, I suspect Ellen to be on the autistic spectrum or a witch, or both. She is extremely sensitive to the supernatural, as many of us on the spectrum have a heightened sensitivity to the energy of the world around us. She recalls her childhood to the professor, explaining that she used to know things before they would happen. She always knew what presents she was receiving, and she knew that her mother was to die. Later on in the film, the professor states to her, quote, "In heathen worlds you might have been a great priestess of Isis," end quote. But alas, she was born into a patriarchal society that fears the feminine and the inherent power that comes with it. In recounting her childhood, she explains that she often would wander off in hypnotic trances. She states, quote, "But as I became older, it worsened. I frightened him. I was so very alone, you see, and I wished for comfort. At last, Papa found me once laying, unclothed I was, my body, my flesh. 'Sin,' he said, 'sin,' end quote." As she grew, Ellen's father no longer viewed this behavior of the actions of his adorable little girl, but instead a dirty, shameful young woman. In that moment when her father found her unclothed and said that it was sin, that was him projecting his own sexual guilt onto her. When girls start to menstruate, they are now able to procreate and are viewed as women under the eyes of patriarchy. Our ability to create life makes us both desirable and dangerous under the eyes of patriarchy. We go from innocence to sexual objects. One minute you are your father's sweet little girl, and then suddenly you are his shame. The shame we carry is similar to that of Hine Nui Te Po, as I mentioned at the start of this video, in which in a split moment she went from being her father's daughter to suddenly being his shame. During puberty, we become aware of the wandering gaze of men, and this confusing shift from maidenhood to womanhood comes with it the understanding of our own immorality, our ability to create life, but also the reminder of death that our menstrual blood brings with it. As Knox states in Nosferatu, the blood is the life, the blood is the life. From this experience with her father and him projecting his sexual shame onto her, Ellen becomes touch deprived. Now, touch is a very normal, healthy human desire to have. Humans are social creatures, and our ability to exchange energy through touch is nothing short of magic. Whether it be romantic touch, sexual touch, or platonic touch, there's nothing wrong with wanting to be held by someone you love. But when you're a woman under a patriarchy that pathologizes women's sexuality, that desire for touch can be used to vilify you. I've seen a lot of discourse saying that Ellen displays signs of hypersexuality, and I have to disagree with this. When men show an interest in sex, it's normal and encouraged, but when women express a desire to have sex, it's a mental illness. I mean, goddess forbid Ellen should want to have sex with her husband. I mean, look at him. You'd want to him too. Unfortunately, her husband Thomas is too busy pursuing the patriarchal idea of what it means to be a good husband, providing for his wife. Ellen doesn't care for material objects like gold or a nice house with lovely furniture. She just wants to be with her husband. In the climax of the film, the two supposedly polarizing characters, Orlok as Death and Ellen as the Maiden, come together to share a moment of ecstasy before both dying in a final embrace. In an interview with USA Today, Bill Skarsgård notes that when reading the script early on, he wrote a note that the final scene was, quote, death and ecstasy, end quote. He says, quote, I want people to go, is he going to bite her face off? And then it turns into a kiss. Nosferatu is a very heightened fairy tale / dark story, but also it's two people potentially falling in love. It isn't love, it's something else, but love is maybe the closest thing that you can kind of relate it to. If it's not love, it's a craving, and it's an appetite, and it's lust and desire to devour, end quote. Ugh. Yes, God. I love him. He goes on to note that Orlok is, quote, seeing the sun for the first time in hundreds of years. So he's mesmerized by it, and fear, and all of these different things. But in a way, maybe that is what Orlok wanted all along, end quote. Lily Rose Depp comments that the final scene is, quote, heartbreaking and kind of bittersweet in a way because she's doing a good deed and she's breaking the curse, but she's also indulging in a dark desire that she has, end quote. Now, with these quotes in mind from the actors who portrayed these characters, one could argue that Orlok and Ellen accepted and perhaps welcomed their fate. And this is very reflective of the Romantic era portrayal of death as ecstasy, death as sweet release, death as catharsis. Or, as Aries puts it in Western attitudes towards sex, quote, these erotic macabre themes, or simply morbid ones, reveal extreme compliance before the spectacle of death, end quote. I've seen a lot of discourse on the internet surrounding consent versus coercion in regards to Ellen and Orlok, and it's not wrong, because Orlok is essentially saying, according to our contract, you must come to me willingly, but if you don't, I'll kill everyone you love. That is not consent, that is, by definition, coercion. However, I argue that that's kind of the point. Coercion is defined as, quote, the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats, end quote. Death is the only guarantee in life, and as much as we may try to prolong it or hide from it, we can never escape our final embrace with death. And because death is something that we cannot avoid, we can never really fully consent to the act of dying. We are all, by product of nature's will, coerced into dying. But some of us may hope to be more compliant in this final act. I believe that the final scene of Nosferatu that showcases Ellen's last moments with Orlok is an erotic and macabre image that reveals, in the words of Aries, extreme compliance before the spectacle of death. Perhaps she was not ready to die. She still had so much life left to live. But according to Orlok, she was not meant for the living. She never quite fit in amongst the society around her. She was viewed as unusual and experienced so much isolation that, as a young maiden, she sought comfort which invited Orlok into her life. Perhaps this is a metaphor for the reality of those of us who feel like an outcast amongst their peers. I am on the autistic spectrum, so like Ellen, I too have experienced social ostracization and feelings of being misunderstood growing up. When you are so lonely and when you feel so rejected and misunderstood by those around you, one can start to wonder if perhaps they would be better off dead. It's not that you want to die, it's just that you don't feel fully human. As I stated at the start of this video, I am a lover of all things macabre and the occult, and this love came about in my childhood where I struggled to connect to my peers and make friends due to my undiagnosed neurodiversity. I found comfort in the darkness, and in the macabre, and in the supernatural, things seen as strange and unusual because I myself was seen as strange and unusual. But I found beauty in these things, just as I suspect Edgar was hoping to do with the final shot of Nosferatu. In an interview with USA Today, Edgar states, quote, "When you see Lily Rose looking like a doll and Bill looking like a skull with a mustache, it's a powerful contrast." End quote. So, like the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, Blessed Ludovica Albertoni, and Sappho at Lucat, Nosferatu too portrays the act of death as an erotic image, and something about that just touches my morbid, gothic, feminine heart. Well, that's all, folks. Tēnā koutou for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. I'm not a professional YouTuber by any means. I just made this out of a love for the film. It touched on a lot of things that are a special interest of mine: mythology, morbid, death, you know, all that jazz. So I just really wanted to make a video essay. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know what your interpretation of the film was. As mentioned at the start of this video, I am a writer. I will link my published writing below. I write a lot about the goddess and mythology and feminism and gender and sexuality and all that. So if you'd like to check that out, see the link below. My name is Vixen Temple. I'm determined to burn the patriarchy. Tēnā koutou for watching. I hope you learned something new.